Patrick, I want to answer the question you asked of Dr. Gigerenzer as though you'd asked me. And I want to leave you with what I think could scratch the itch characteristic. With science finds validation exclusively, entirely, only through the predictive strength of its models. And then to evaluate that, because I know Dale's heard me say this a lot, definitions don't come flavored right or wrong. They're just consistent or useful, and I'd like you to look, use that definition as a lens and look how some issues refract through that. It's fascinating. I would start with the demarcation problem. We learned there from Wikipedia, just why not go there? And I always tell people, look at Wikipedia. I love picking on those people. That's some of the best and the worst things I've seen written on science sit there, but there's always something to talk about. But I would go on the demarcation problem. They say it's a problem. We learned that this has been a problem that is unsettled. It's been a problem for several thousand years. Where you're going to go, geez, I solved it right here. It's predictive strength. That is the demarcation. You go over to interpretations of probability, and you find that there's a war basically being fought over whether probability inheres in objects in our heads. And you see there, it's interesting, there's another article, Wikipedia article, Foundation of Statistics, and you learn there too that it's Sodom and Gomorrah-like in terms of the confusion, and that somehow the solution to the statistics foundation's problem finds resolution in probability theory, and you get over there and you find out that that's another conflict. Armed with the understanding that science models find their validation exclusively, solely through their predictive strength, you look at these articles, and there's just not much problem for you. You have to side with the people that think probability inheres in the head. You also have to take exception to the frequentists that tell you that the probability of a hypothesis has no meaning, that hypotheses have to come flavored 1 or 0 like all propositions. That's the deductive curse that they're living with. And it's interesting, so they do a little probability of the frequentist sort, and you get that p-value, and if that p-value is magically 5%, now my proposition carries a 1 or a 0. It's all of a sudden I'm back in deductive land again. It all seems nuts. What else do we look at? Scientific misconduct. It's abundantly clear that when we cleanse validation from the scientific method, the charlatans are going to have a party. They're gonna jump up and down and get all excited, and there's someone who has a fiduciary obligation to say, you mean all I need is a couple of scientists to put on a masthead, a study, and some good p-values? And yes, that's all you need. And it's done all the time. It's done all the time. So and the utility of that definition expresses itself in the application and where it can take you. The ultimate hope is that when someone tells you that if you don't believe them, you don't believe in science, or someone's touting a model that's never demonstrated anything anywhere, you walk away. And I don't care if a guy's got a stethoscope, a computer, a Geiger counter, the white lab coat, all that shit, forget it. Until there's something of predictive strength, you got nothing. Right, Malcolm? Any questions?
I have a question.
Please.
Is science real in this house?
No, it's part of my, see the man-made tools of science there on the wall? Science would be on that list too. Science is an interesting thing. My father was of the view that it may be the only discipline where knowing its limitations, boundaries, and the extent to which it can weigh in must be known. And it was on this basis that he said that conflicts between religion and science come about through confusion about what religion is and what science is. You have to be confused on both. He put himself in instant disfavor with the Science Framework Committee in California They thought he was going to beat up the creationists, but instead the science bear got after them hard and told them that they were no better off than the people they're making fun of. And that's something. Imagine how enjoyable that must have been. Questions? We're going to shift gears here. Dale, I'm going to let you introduce Daubert. Sure. I won't even try. But it was my idea to be talking about this here today because I think we have the talent. And you're talking to me. I'm not the guy. I don't believe in social crusades. But I think this Supreme Court decision could get reversed, and done so logically, and we might know the people to put to that task. To explain.
So I don't know that it's quite a departure. I think it's a natural. It's at least at a point. It's an off ramp in a lot of the things you've been talking about. I was thinking about it as you were saying it, and it goes back to the question I just spoke with Dr. Garrett about, which is. He asked the question about how do you put quantitative measures to this, where you've got both DNA evidence, for example, which has a very serious quantitative side to it, alongside in a context of a legal proceeding. How do you do that where it's largely qualitative? And I'll pick up there and say that what you have is we use some mathematics in civil trials, for example. You have to prove something. To say it's more likely than not. We call it the preponderance of the evidence. And what that really means is, we joke in law school, we call it 51% or 50.1%. It's more likely than not likely that something is true. And the person who can prove that wins the civil trial to your satisfaction sitting on the jury. It's only more likely than not. And there are other standards for proving damages or certain other things where the law says, no, it can't just be preponderance, not more likely than not. It's got to be another standard, clear and convincing evidence. And so where does that fall? It's not quite beyond a reasonable doubt. It's more than a preponderance. So 62%, you give it kind of a qualitative term. You try and paint a word picture to deal with that. And then, of course, we have this beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not beyond all doubt. So you're trying to put words to some kind of measure to get us to a standard of evidence. And really, the answer to Dr. Garrett's question is, the way you manage this problem in the law, typically, it seems to me, in my experience, is they assign who has the burden for failure to produce sufficient evidence of a particular matter. So in the criminal trial, we say that the government has the burden, and if they can't get to beyond a reasonable doubt, then they lose. So they bear the burden. That's how we assign the burdens where we think they should lie for the failure to produce sufficient evidence. Now, this comes up where it relates to what Greg asked me, Dan, and others to talk about is scientific evidence in courts. And so just a brief history is in 1927, so I believe the same year as the Solvay conference, was a case came out called Fry versus the United States. And Fry was interesting. It was criminal, and it involved a lie detector test, the earliest version of it, measuring your body's physiological responses to questions. And of course, immediately you think when you hear that, oh, let me guess, the government was trying to convict a guy using lie detector evidence. And actually, it turns out, no, it's just the opposite. A guy was trying to prove his innocence and said that the court refusing to consider his clear polygraph, had wrongly convicted him. And the court and Fry came out and created really the standard that would apply all the way through Daubert, was the Fry test. And that was this idea about reliability of evidence, how you could call it scientific evidence in court. And it went 70 years almost, the Fry standard reigned. And in the interim during that time, what happened was the passage of the Federal Rules of Evidence had been sort of compiled and put together in the 50s, and you had changes to the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. And then it brings us forward to Daubert, which became the standard. The Supreme Court looking and asking the question, was Fry changed by the passage of the Federal Rules of Evidence, and specifically Rule 702, that deals with expert testimony? And the Supreme Court said yes, in fact, it was changed, and so they threw out Fry, and they put this new standard in. I will tell you that of import, I think it's important to blame the lawyers. I got a plaque when I left flying to become a lawyer, and it was from all my helicopter buddies, and right on it, it just said, on the plaque, it said, "Shakespeare was right." And that's what they gave me, the first thing is kill all the lawyers. And I always thought that was a nice thing to take with me. I know Greg would have loved that. In fact, I might gift that to you at some point. But I think the lawyers bear, and the judges, maybe not the lawyers, but the lawyers in robes, worse yet, bear a good deal of responsibility for what we have now with peer review and all of this, because one of the things they found in Fry and going forward was that part of how you could get things admitted, you could get experts on the stand to be decreed experts, and therefore to be able to pontificate to the jurors to a scientific or medical certainty, was the law said, well, we're going to look at this guy's resume. And that's part of how we decide whether it's scientific or not. Are you published in any peer-reviewed journals? And once that became reified by the Supreme Court and decisions over time, to me, if you look at the when of some of those decisions, it tracks very nicely with the rise of these peer-reviewed journals, and suddenly you've got just garbage being pumped out. I mean, if you're a corporate entity and you know the Supreme Court has said, hey, this is what it's going to take to get an expert opinion in, and you just start making journals, printing papers and getting experts to say, and you can look at whether it's food, nutrition, pharma, pick any of those things, and you'll find a concomitant rise in the publication of these journals. I mean, look at how, I was just talking to somebody in line, Einstein published the theory of relativity, while a Swiss patent clerk. What was his expertise? What are your justifications for saying such a thing? I don't know if he would have passed the Fry standard. Really, would Einstein have qualified under Fry? Probably not, to be an expert. Can he even offer such an opinion? And I think that really is at the heart of part of this problem, is we've concretized these notions that peer review is how you get to a correct finding. And I don't know, Dan, what else you want to say about that?
I'll say what Jeff Glassman said: the best science is not peer reviewed; it's top secret.
It's a difficult thing to explain science to lay people, and particularly where they've got to make decisions, to Anton's point, about what do you do where there's DNA evidence, and they're going to come in and say, and Gert talked about it, trying to instruct the federal judiciary and trying to train them that you can't really say make the assertions that you're making, and so we kind of play these linguistic games to not allow experts to basically tell people, that guy's guilty. And which is really what prosecutors want, obviously, or if it's two civil litigants, you want to prove that guy's full of crap, we're right. And you really now, much of litigation has become a war of experts. But it comes out of these Fry, Daubert misunderstandings and misapprehensions. I think in the materials, Greg pointed to a Susan Hack piece. Did you put that in there? But it's worth your time. Those, you're all interested in this notion of how we know what we know of both epistemological and ontological questions, but it comes together in trials. That's where, it really, at least for me, not so much in the laboratory. That's my laboratory. That's where it all comes together. But I know that we've talked about, and Dan, Dan's brother Harry, we're all thinking about ways in which Daubert can be kind of torn down. Sometimes the Supreme Court announces standards, and then in practice it becomes sort of more, it's observed more in the breach than it is in the actual following, that life itself, a lot of times, will dictate how we actually have to deal with these issues of scientific evidence and what counts as expert testimony.
How it can be cost prohibitive. I had a really interesting conversation with Bobby Kennedy, who's done a lot of these cases. And he was explaining to me about how if you have a population of people that have been harmed in some way by toxic chemicals that have been thrown in, the Hudson River or whatever, and you can tell very clearly there was this and then there was that, but it's corollary, and you have a huge industrial power that's basically saying, this isn't scientific. He often finds that when he gets to the Daubert pre-hearing, he can't even move the case forward because it's such a gatekeeper, and these small groups of people who have been harmed don't have the resources to go and pay a bunch of experts to do a study and have it be published in a peer-reviewed journal. But the industry side does, and they're ready for it, and they've already got their defense made. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
I had a great example of this. You know, Daubert has become such a gate that you can't, it really is where judges are supposed to keep out the junk science. And so I give you a great example of this in a criminal trial where it comes up. We were defending someone. In fact, it was what led to me meeting Greg and going forward. I was in a murder trial, and we had, our client had been analyzed for PTSD, but not just PTSD, what's it called, CTE now it's called, or we called it TBI at the time, you know. Yeah, so we had a client who had been exposed to multiple large explosions that had impact, and this was in the earliest days of the VA looking at this, and there was a doctor, Maria Moritidis was her name, you can look her up. She was heading Walter Reed at the time, and she was doing all the studies on the consequences on troops of having bombs drop nearby or these other things and what effect it had on the brain. And they have a series of tests they can do to measure cognitive function, or executive function they call it. And so they offered, thankfully, the government was like, hey, you know, since we've tested some of the other defendants in this case, there were 8 co-defendants in this murder trial, and they said, hey, do you want to have your guy tested? And we were like, well, what the hell, you know, sure, why not? Let's have him tested. And they had him tested, and we thought, if nothing else, it could be useful if he gets convicted, which it was looking likely since 5 of his comrades were going to testify against him, had already taken deals. We thought, you know, it wouldn't hurt for extenuation and mitigation when we get to sentencing. So they do the testing and they come back, we get the report, and they basically tell us, you do know that your guy's brain is badly damaged, right? And we're like, sure. He was a simple guy, you know, he had had a lot of problems passing the ASVAB, and somebody, Patrick, would be like, I don't think you can fail the ASVAB. He did. And so it took him 3 times to actually get a score that would get him into the Marine Corps. And he had a really tough life, black kid from East St. Louis. And, but he was badly damaged. And we had to have a Daubert hearing. Now we want to bring this evidence in on the merits, because part of the case involved, you know, was he wrong to have made a decision he made during this murder? And, you know, he was given an order to do something, and defects in executive function suggest that when you're faced with a lot of different information, you'll just fall back to the easiest heuristic, which is, hey, orders are lawful, I'll just do what I'm told, because I can't sort this out. And that was part of our defense, became at the heart of our defense. But when we tried to get that evidence in, all these tests, clear science, you know, tests, so we got science. We got science, they did it. But at the time it was considered cutting edge or new science. And most importantly of all is now the government, who had tested this guy, using their doctor who's running the tests out of Walter Reed, the government now objects and says, you can't put that in. It's not science. It hasn't passed peer review, and it didn't meet the Daubert, you know, factors. And so we couldn't get past the Daubert hump. And so here we are with this wonderful evidence, the government's own science-y people who are now going to come in and testify on our behalf. And it was only largely by begging and groveling and getting the judge to agree that we could put some of it in, but not all of it. But it was Daubert. It was that exact problem, which is we ran right up against the Daubert, it's not peer reviewed yet. You know, it's not. And the funny thing about Daubert is it's interpreting Rule 702. It claims to be, and 702 says that anybody could be an expert. That's the crazy thing. Lay people, you all have expertise. There are things you know about that you think, no one can tell me about this. That on a certain subject, we all kind of have our own things. And the standard in the rules of evidence is if anybody can come in and be an expert, provided that they have testimony that will help the fact finder in rendering a decision. And so it doesn't even need to be some recognized scientific field, but this is what we've come up against, is when you add these Daubert factors, which is to say we've reified, the law has reified consensus science into valid science. And I think that's a large part of why we are where we are. So, now it's a question of finding the right circumstances to take a crack at it, to try and find a way to break Daubert's hold on us.
I'll just refer you to David Sackett, who some of you may have heard of, was essentially the founder of evidence-based medicine. Really brilliant guy, I met him a few times. About 20 years ago, he wrote a series of articles saying all experts should be compulsorily retired after 3 years. Because he was doing work in evidence-based medicine. He said, my opinions have become too powerful. People are paying too much attention to me. And I'm not going to write or do any work in this field ever again, and didn't from that point. But he then wrote another article saying, well, I have called for the compulsory removal of all experts after 3 years, but none of them have actually gone. But I think it would be interesting to try and see if we could work maybe alongside that idea of, well, who are these people, why are they experts, and why do their opinion carry all this weight, when actually all they're doing is acting as a barrier to progress, and they have too much power.
Well, I'm curious what you think is like the substitute week, right? Because a judge, as a patient, will allow the time. You don't want the most charismatic person being able to convince people that something is scientific when it's not, right? So there has to be some litmus test.
I think we tell ourselves a tale when we think that we're going to, that people decide things on a purely rational basis in court. I was telling some people in line that I was very fortunate as a trial lawyer for many years. I've done hundreds of cases to juries. And I got summoned for jury duty not too many years ago, 5-6 years ago, in San Diego County. And I thought for sure, usually it's that they never let lawyers be on juries, never. No lawyer in their right mind would ever want another lawyer. I would never allow a lawyer to go back and be telling my jury. Like, I only want them to be listening to one lawyer, not that guy. They didn't listen to this lawyer, not even the judge, you know what he's doing. But both the defense and the prosecution, it's a criminal case, San Diego County, and they both seemed to think that I was fine to go back there. And so now I'm a lawyer sitting back in the jury room. It was the best experience I've ever had for, just being able to see what jury deliberations. I've run mock juries and, all kinds of things like that. So you get to see jury deliberations. But it's different when it's the real deal. And it was an interesting thing to me. I'll say that I continue to have faith in the system. I still believe in juries getting it right. I think it's really hard to fool 12 people. It really... What's that? Of course not. Not guilty. But I think that the idea that, well, we need to have only this dry recitation and that's how trials will be decided. I think the common law system has served us well for many, many years. It doesn't always get it right, but I think the times that juries get it wrong are typically because of policy decisions that lawyers make about what they can hear or can't hear. Either we give them information they shouldn't have, or we keep information away from them that they should have. I think that's where you see miscarriages of justice generally. There are things about, Holmes, as much as I hate him because he was a progressive, I'll say that he had a great line about the life of the law has not been logic, but experience. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the rules of evidence aren't logical rules. For example, there's a rule of evidence that says you can't use propensity evidence to prove that somebody committed a crime. For example, if you go to the bar every Friday night and you get drunk and fight people, fast forward now and you were at a bar and there's a fight and you're being blamed for it. We don't allow the jury to know that your history is such that you go into the bar every night and get in fights. And there's a great opinion about this where the court says, it's not because it's not probative. It's not because we're not saying that would tend to prove, make it more likely than not that you did it. But we don't allow it not because it's probative. We disallow it because it's so probative. Because it's too probative, and the risk is that we'll convict innocent people not based on what happened that night, but for the things they did in the past that we haven't convicted them of. And so there are choices made, evidentiary choices, filters that we impose. So I think it would be unwise to think of ways in which we're going to reduce this to a formulaic recitation. The other part of that is that courts, if any of you have ever been part of a court, I know Greg was watching the Fannie Willis trial and some of us were talking about it, and it's extraordinarily compelling. It's a drama. Court cases and courts are very much, they lend themselves well. They're like plays. You know, the actor goes off stage, you know, exeunt, out comes the next act, dramatis personae, and then we do this. And they are like mini high school theater productions. But if you're a part of it, there are things that you will pick up, things that will be important to you, things that the jurors pick up that no amount of watching and not being there will really attune you to. I once had a case where a guy got convicted, but he got a great sentence and he didn't get kicked out of the Marine Corps. He had clearly done it. But at the end of it, one of the jurors pulled me aside and he goes, "Sir, can I talk to you a minute?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." Kind of pull off to the side and he goes, "Sir, did anybody come in here and tell the truth this whole trial?" and I had to laugh because he had gotten to the heart of the matter, which is everybody who came in and lied. You know, the victim, the alibi witness, you know, every defense witness, every prosecution witness had come on and lied their ass off. And those of us who knew the facts were sort of just along for the ride. And the jury got right through it and got to the heart of it. So I say that to you because somebody reading that record would have concluded, had they taken the words, the naked words on the page, they would have had a vastly different understanding of that case. And yet those of us who were participants, and even me, my guy was convicted, but at least he didn't get the bad conduct discharge. But even for me, I thought the jurors got it perfectly correct. They saw right through it all. So the fix for me would be to tear down Daubert. What would I replace it with? You know, not lawyers. I think it would be a system in which we trust the juries a little more and we downplay the necessity and need and expertise of the expertocrats.
And I don't want to dominate all the questions because Dale, I do have access to Dale, so other people should feel like they can ask questions too. But the other thing is, like, just procedurally, Congress ratified it, right? So it's not just up to the Supreme Court to overturn it. Like, if the goal is to get rid of it, what do you do about the congressional oversight?
It's in the Federal Rules of Evidence,
Yeah.
which is not passed by Congress. It's by committees, judges and lawyers, and approved from time to time. It's a lengthy process. But it could be the interpretation of the federal rule could be changed by the Supreme Court. Now, I want to address your question of the very charismatic, expert who just bamboozles the jury. I don't think that's near as big a problem as critics think. And the solution to it is to have a good lawyer cross-examining that son of a bitch. And I don't care how many times he succeeds in bamboozling the jury, eventually he'll come a cropper. And he won't be able to testify anywhere after that. I've had that happen in my experience. So.
Were there trials held on Zoom during the pandemic? And do you think that a lot of information was lost in terms of missing body language, seeing people sweat and such?
I was horrified, and I made my thoughts known when the courts started shutting down. I couldn't believe. There's a standard that Supreme Court's talked about in some of the cases involving some of the World War II cases, like not Ex parte Milligan, but some of the cases in the past, the Supreme Court has said, hey, we don't, unless there's a war on, we don't shut the courts down. And given what we knew about, what Jay had already shown very early on about the likely fatality rate for COVID, I was horrified that courts were like that, willing to shut down. And I'll just share with you all that wasn't accidental, that for years leading up to this, judges, federal judges and the judiciary had been in training, lots of training. You can look back where the government was training our judges on how they had to work with the government in the event of a pandemic. And so part of the pandemic response included shutting down the courts, and that had been put in place, the training for that had been put in place years before. And I thought it was a clear violation of rights. I know a lot of judges tried to find ways around it, but some people challenged it unsuccessfully. But yeah, I think there were, people's rights were clearly violated, their legal rights to get a fair trial, to get a jury trial.
But specifically, do you think that it altered results? Because people couldn't see witnesses sweating, shaking hands under the table, that kind of thing.
No question in my mind, not a shred of doubt in my mind that people, you can't do the same, you cannot get the same result from looking through a screen. I mean, that's why, you know, we have TV Vice, you know, these trials in person. It unquestionably makes a difference.
Yeah, there are cases, you know, plaintiffs limping to the witness stand in a personal injury trial, and then the juror spots them sprinting down the hall. Have a break.
Yeah, those happen not just on the Brady Bunch, for those of us who grew up watching that. That is a real thing. That has happened many, many times where witnesses will get on the stand and have some kind of affect in front of the jury, and then the jurors will later see them in the restroom, or see them out by the vending machine laughing and joking or behaving in some different way, and the jurors will conclude, perhaps correctly, that person's a fraud. You know, so that's what's that? Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. No one really knows what happened there.
So you're saying that, so if a juror inadvertently sees someone like outside of court engaging in behavior that they think is inconsistent, are they like mandated to not take that into account, or are they allowed to take that into account? Is it, where's the line? Where's the line?
The school book answer and then the real answer. So the school book answer is no, they're not supposed to consider that. And the judge gives them instructions about what they can and can't do, how they should consider evidence. We give them all kinds of instructions. You can only use this, we give them limited instructions. You can use this evidence solely for impeachment, not to determine that this guy was guilty or not guilty. And depending on the nature of the impeachment, you'll be like, oh, right. And then they go back into the jury room, and then we say, in some sense, the law kind of provides an out and says we don't want to know, because they say, hey, no one will ever be able to question you about what happened back in the jury room. Secret deliberations. You know, we don't invade that except in the rarest of circumstances. So I think that the answer is, yeah, they're not supposed to consider extrajudicial matters. You'll see juries get sequestered. You'll see them be told you can't look in the papers, you can't see this, you're not supposed to consider this other stuff. But on the other hand, they're human beings. And you can well imagine, you'd think to yourself, maybe I saw something, suppose I saw something that made me think this guy's innocent. And yet you saw something that was extrajudicial. Would you go back there and say, nah, I'm going to send that guy to jail because I wasn't supposed to consider that? When whatever you saw made you firmly convinced that he wasn't guilty. And so I can just tell you that I was telling somebody else this story, and jurors are allowed to talk about their experiences. The rule is that no one else can ask about it, but they can talk about it if they want. But they shouldn't give away anybody else's, deliberations. But I'll tell you, when I was part of that criminal trial, we were told specifically that matters of the law can't be brought in from outside to be considered by the jury. But the four-person, in my criminal case had pointed out that the government, this is a great example of this, the government had impeached the defendant. He had gotten on the stand in his own defense and said, that's not what happened, I didn't do it, something else. And the government impeached him while he was on the stand because you're allowed to impeach with prior convictions. So they had prior convictions of this guy. Now they're not using it, the judge says it's not propensity evidence. We're not saying just because he's got 2 prior convictions involving physical violence or assault that therefore he committed this assault. We're just impeaching with the prior convictions. So we're all back in the jury room, and I'm trying to keep my mouth as quiet and not interject myself. I'm kind of listening to all of this. And the forewoman says in California, it's widely understood that there's a 3 strikes law. That in California, after you've had 2 convictions, number 3 means it's coming with a term of years. That's not, it's mandatory. We're not supposed to consider that. I just sat there listening to this, thought it was fascinating that one of the jurors were like, hey, if he's already got 2 convictions, this one means he's going down. And all the Californians in the room, and I'm a Californian at the time, but I'm a transplant, let's be honest. And they all look at each other nodding, going, oh my God, that's right. And at the end of the day, nobody would vote for convict. Nobody would do it. And I suspect that it had to do with the fact that everybody believed if he got convicted, he was going down hard. And no matter what you believed about the case itself, the circumstances were such that it seemed a harsh result, given the nature of the case. And so nobody would have voted to convict, and he walked. I got no problem with that. No problem at all. But, so yes, you know, it does come up for real. It really does.
Dale, what's the, it seems like the logic of a jury trial is one of consensus. So what's the likelihood of Dahlberg, when it's consistent with the kind of overall logic of the apparatus?
It's interesting you say that. I'm not sure it is, because I think well, I'll say that both are present, because on the one hand you say, well, juries are based on consensus, which is to say, but it depends on the jurisdiction. When it comes to criminal trials, in civil court, we want a unanimous verdict. It's got to be 12-0. So the consensus has to be absolute. And that, you know, favors the defense. All I need is one. All I need is one. And so I think that on the one hand, yeah, consensus certainly is part of it. The community has to, we have to come to and to talk about, somebody mentioned that, Peter did, about how within the context of science, we have this ongoing process that's iterative and can keep going, pursuing knowledge, but in the context of the case, it's like, hey man, this thing's gotta be over by Thursday. Like at some point, we're moving on. And that's really what that does, is it puts you know, kind of a stake in the ground, and now that's how we're gonna be. So I don't know that Dahlberg couldn't be overturned. I think it could. I think it could, and I don't think simply because civil trials are kind of, more likely than not, let's get enough of them to agree. But that's because there's only money at stake, you know? So, no, I don't think it's inconsistent. I don't think.
One of the other things that's interesting that I feel like you could elaborate on, certainly, with Dahlberg, was that there's a lot of stuff where people say it was the right decision because of the specifics within the case. So the case was looking at kids who had birth defects, and they were trying to blame Dow Chemicals. And it later came out that the science said, there's no way these chemicals cause those birth defects. So people use the specifics in the case to justify the rule, which has nothing to do with, it should have nothing to do with the specifics of the case.
Yeah. There's an old lawyer saying that hard cases make bad law. And it's one of those things where you're because of this limitation, this time stake we have where the race is going to be over, here's the finish line, we got to do the best we can with what's here. And then why should we give that broader application? You know, why should there even be precedent in that sense, you know? And yeah, it's a problem, particularly when the scientific knowledge changes. You know, I'll say this, depending on when the knowledge changed, you would have, if you can prove it quickly enough, depending on how long's passed, you've got an opportunity for a retrial, reconsideration. You know, there's other mechanism. We do allow some safety valve mechanisms to try and go back and fix things on appeal, you know, new evidence, those kinds of things. So there are some safety valves built in to do that, but the courts like to move on, to be honest with you. I think part of it is the judges don't want anybody going back and spending too much time laboring over what the idiot judge did. I think that's part of the reason for the finality. Susan Hack's piece discusses this. I commend it to all of you, but in part you find judges falling for falsification as the demarcation for science. And obviously that we know, those of us who are here are members of the David Stove Society or whatever we want to call ourselves, would disagree strongly with that. And yeah, it's a problem. They really conflated, if you look at that Hack piece and you look at Dahlberg, Fry, and the judges' opinions, particularly Rehnquist's, it's disappointing to say the least, that you've got judges who almost just sort of throwing their hands up and like, who am I but a simple judge? How can I be expected to even know what science is? You know, it seems to me it's a conscious lowering of the bar and suggesting that let's just not try and get to know too much here. You know, it seems to me a kind of a plea to ignorance on the part of federal judges, but maybe that's just me having higher hopes for my profession than I should. So, Dan, anything else on that?
No. Well, Roger, aren't you friends with Glenn Reynolds? I think What would help change the Supreme Court's mind is kind of a tsunami of law review articles by eminent
Law review.
law review articles by eminent professors. If we could get some of them on board, and we might could start with Glenn, writing articles criticizing Daubert on different grounds. That's kind of would give it some impetus from the academic sector for them to pay attention and maybe change the rule.
The Amici on Daubert is an extensive list, and it was all academics. There was no one from industry. So Harvard weighed in on what science is and got it wrong. Stanford did, got it wrong. They should ask someone over at Intel.
So we get, law professors writing law review articles and then filing amicus briefs and maybe have a good case to have to find the case.
I like that. Yeah, I think that Jan's got a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. That is a good recommendation. A lot of the changes in the law review articles wind up being very, very influential. And in many of the cases in the 60s, a lot of the cases in the 60s, the civil rights cases, really came out of law review. They were academics sort of publishing these ideas, and then people would go, hey, let's turn that into a test case and then see if we can. And then you find Supreme Court, using borrowing language from law review articles. I mean, that's how New York Times versus Sullivan came to be the way it is, actually. Probably needs to be changed back, but yeah, that law review articles is a good place to start. It would be a good. I'll get that from you. I'd love to see that. Maybe reach out and we could start thinking about, ways in which, or maybe Matt and I have talked about, and we've been putting this off, but something that, the rules of evidence for science, something that can kind of bring these disparate threads together.
I don't know if you're aware, but there was a Supreme Court ruling that happened in 2019 or 2020 that was based largely on a Yale Law School review. It was called the Antibody Patent Paradox. And it changed the way a lot of things happened right before COVID. You're probably not aware, but the monoclonal antibody market was about $150 billion before the pandemic. And that meant that you could patent an antibody that you developed, and you had patent the way that you produced the antibody. However, the way that you patented was to describe the methodology, and this Yale Law School review noticed that the formulation in these patents was just starting to be repeated. We baked a cake, we put the frosting on it, and now this is our cake, and we're selling it as a patented antibody. But it turns out that antibodies as a correlate of immunity are a terrible model of how the immune system functions, but have been perpetuated through broken science for decades, and perpetuated by broken science, also funded by this $150 billion industry. So once the science caught up, it took an actual law review article to express the incongruency between the known science of monoclonal antibodies and what they were representing them as in IP patents. And so this, in 2020, basically put all of these really valuable patents on incredibly shaky ground, essentially suggesting that all of them wouldn't stand up to scrutiny in court. And so that's why you see at the beginning of the pandemic that we went from monoclonal antibodies to nothing, because monoclonal antibodies were very feared as a investment that wouldn't be protectable in the IP landscape anymore, because the biology didn't support their unique inventiveness. And so that's a really good explanation, or an example of how a law school or law review could change that landscape in a very aggressive way.
Getting it into the best, the mostest, bestest of the law, the law school, getting it into the Yale Law Review, obviously, or the Harvard, and you've got to think about getting past the gatekeepers there. And then, of course, there's the question of, given what we're witnessing, which is the collapse of the expertocracy, do you even want to go there? Do you even want to be there? So it's a difficult question. That's where the change would be made, and yet, by its nature, I mean, let's be honest, given what we've seen with Harvard's own president, as you alluded to, Emily, you know, with the presidents of both Stanford and Harvard going down in just a flaming pile of dog crap. Who saw that coming? I didn't have that on my bingo card last year.
The Stanford one, that unwound slowly. It just took too long to keep up with it. But he pinned some malfeasance on an assistant who left in shame, and then came back later with a promotion and is like a girlfriend now or something. Everyone saw through the whole thing. It was pretty bad. Isn't that? Am I right on that? Isn't that what's?
Yeah, it's similar. I mean, what I think is interesting is that with a lot of these, it's the college newspapers that are breaking these stories, right? So the Harvard Crimson broke the Dana-Farber story. The Stanford newspaper really was on top of the president more than anybody else. The mainstream media then is forced to cover, to do a piece on it, and then they go away, and the kids are still working hard. I mean, that gives me some hope and optimism in the sort of abysmal media market right now. But there are these kids doing really great work that, is what we would expect from the mainstream, and we're not getting it.
I think the effort's worth it. I just think that, it's worth it if only for the fact that look at how many jurists come from Harvard and Yale, and we're run largely by the skull and bones, and it's at least in the legal side of the house, and so it's a worthwhile effort for sure.
I'm recognizing something might be wrong with me, and that I can't imagine a greater university experience than removing the dean. That's cool.
Well, you went to Harvard for 5 years, didn't you, Greg? What? You went to Harvard for 5 years, didn't you?
That's right, 5 years straight. Peter's going to talk to us about open access publishing, if he doesn't mind. How do you like that, Peter? And then we'll take some questions, and I think we're done.
Should I make this quick then, so everyone can...
Make it unbelievable.
Well, I'd rather make it believable, actually. But I just offered to say something for a few minutes about open access publishing and actually open science generally, because actually I hadn't realized that people would talk about this, but a couple of the talks yesterday actually hit on the how one of the problems in academic research now is the publishing industry and the effect that it has on research behavior and costs. So I'll give you a little bit of autobiography. So about 15 years ago, probably, I was working at the University of Cardiff in Wales, and I was sitting in a staff meeting where, as is frequent in the university system anywhere, I think, there was a discussion of the dire financial situation facing the department and budget cuts and things like that. And we discovered, for the first time ever, I realized that we were told how much our university was spending on journal subscriptions in the area of physics and astronomy, which is how I was working. And it turned out, I don't remember the exact figures, but I do remember that if we didn't pay the journal subscriptions anymore, we could appoint 2 more faculty members. And being a physicist, ever since the early 1990s, in astrophysics especially, which was the field that I work in, almost every research paper has been put on the archive. The archive is a free repository. Anyone can download papers from it. It's actually run out of Cornell, but it's recently had big donations from the Simons Foundation. So it's actually, it's not a sort of amateurish thing. It's well funded. And since the early 90s, I don't think I've ever really looked at a journal, a physics journal, because everything is free on the archive. All the relevant research papers go on there. And, every physics department that I'm aware of, every physics and astronomy department has a journal club that they run every week. The graduate students download papers from the archive and discuss them. And there's never any reference to actually going to the journal website. So that was the early 90s. I think that the archive actually started 93. Okay, it was bit smaller thing than it is now. It's actually very good. Actually, if you look at the archive, how many of you here have seen the archive? Actually, there's a few. It still looks, the front page looks like a 1990s web page, which I quite like about it. It's not, there's no kind of wasted fancy graphics and things on the front page. It's very direct what it does. So the idea that I had when I heard how much the journal subscriptions were costing was basically, why do we bother with these journals? Why don't we just use the archive and forget about the journals? Of course, the answer is peer review. The answer everyone comes up with is journals do peer review. So we need to have that quality mark so we know that the paper archive is not peer reviewed. So basically anyone can put a paper on archive and there's no guarantee that it's actually correct. There's some moderation on the archive, but it's not equivalent to peer review.
You need an academic address.
Yeah, but well, if you don't, you can still be sponsored by someone who can get you in if you haven't got an academic address. So, but there is some gatekeeping there, but it's not the same as peer review. So, and then at the same time, roughly about 15, 20 years ago, the open science movement got going. And so the main logic about this was that in an area like astrophysics or cosmology, most of the research is funded by the taxpayer. It's blue skies research, it's not making commercial products and so on. And since the taxpayer is paying for this research, it seems to me that it's a moral obligation that the taxpayer should have access to that research that they've already paid for, instead of paying a library a subscription of several £1,000s a year to access a journal. So this is the open access publishing idea. It's actually only part of the open science movement because the other parts are open data, and in my field as well, big experimental result, big program, observational programs actually are mandated to make all of their data publicly available. So that is something that we do in astrophysics. It's by no means the case in other fields, like in medical research, for example, people don't generally release all of their data. They keep a hold of the data. And it seems to me, we talked a lot yesterday about reproducibility. A key part of science is that if you make a claim of a research result based on some data, somebody somewhere else, some other research team should be able to take that data and check whether you did it right or not, or even discover other things in the data that you didn't find. So this seems to be a principle which we have been doing in astronomy for 30 years, but it's very, in astronomy, if somebody publishes a result based on a paper and you wonder about it or think it can be generalized in some way, you just email the people there and say, can I have the data? And they say, sure. And that's not what happens in many other fields. So open access publishing isn't everything. The principle of open science is that everything that's needed to produce a scientific result described in a paper or any other source should be made available for somebody else to do the analysis again and check that you did it right. That's open science. So I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'll go back to the open access publishing. What happened with this was the move to say, well, actually, we should, instead of people having to pay a subscription for journals or for their institute library to pay a subscription to a journal, the results of scientific research should be made available free of charge to anyone who wants to see them. And then the question is, who pays for this process? You can't charge a subscription. How do you pay for it? And at this point, the academic journal industry jumped in on this movement and was terrified that it was going to lose its profits. So to put that figure in perspective, as in 2020, the global revenues of the academic publishing industry exceeded by about 50% the entire global revenues of the recorded music industry. And until the open access movement came along, So that's many tens of billions. The profit margins for big publishers like Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Wiley, and so on, exceed the profit margins for the big tech companies like Google and Apple. And if you want to know why they're making such big profits, just look at their business model. So imagine a restaurant, liken the academic publishing industry to a restaurant. It's a restaurant in which the customers bring all their own food, the ingredients. They're charged to cook the food on the premises. The owners of the restaurant then sell the meal back to the people who are eating them, and all of that is revenue, and their outlay is very low, because we do all the cooking, and we're the people who read the papers. We do the eating as well. So we pay twice. Right? So if we're paying page charges or something, we're paying to eat in the restaurant, we're also paying subscriptions for it. And so they've been making huge amounts of money by stealth, largely, because for most academics, this money was coming from a library budget, which is not the budget that they see in their own department. It comes from elsewhere in the university. We were told about 20 years ago that when digital publishing came in, the cost of academic publishing would go down, which is a not unreasonable thing to happen. It's quite cheap to put papers on the internet. It's almost costs nothing to put it. And most journals are now online only. It used to be expensive to produce hard copies and mail them all around the world and so on, and there was a legitimate cost there, but now there isn't. Incidentally, the cost of putting a paper and curating a paper kind of forever on archive is about $11 for one paper. So that curates the platform and actually hosts the data that's in your paper. That's on average. Some cost more because they're bigger data sets and things. So the cost of actually publishing a thing on archive is a few dollars. What happened with the academic journal industry was that they said, okay, we'll do open access. That means we can't charge subscriptions. And the only thing we can do to maintain the revenue that would be lost from subscriptions is to charge the authors. So they invented a thing called the article processing charge, page charges. Some journals have been charging page charges for a while. And that means now that academics are asked to, or research teams or whatever, are asked to pay upfront to publish their papers, open access. And the cost is several £1,000, even more $1,000 per paper. For one paper, the journals that I work with, you typically charge $3,000 as an article processing fee. Now that cost has nothing to do with publishing a paper, the cost of publishing and disseminating a paper. It's simply a charge to replace the revenue lost from subscriptions, which you didn't really know about before, because unless you looked at the library thing. Now you have to pay out of your research grant. Researchers are saying, hang on, does it really cost this amount of money to publish a paper? Of course it doesn't, it's all profit. That's where the money comes from. The actual cost of publishing has gone way down, but the profit margin has gone up. And it's easy money. So I thought this is nonsense. This is a parasitical industry. Back in the 18th century, obviously, printing and circulating scientific papers around the world was expensive and difficult, and academic publishers fulfilled a useful purpose in doing that. There wasn't any other way of doing it in those days. But we're still stuck with the system of academic publishers, even though we're now in a digital era, and I can write a paper, put it on the internet, and instantly anyone around the world can actually access it. The cost is, it's just maintaining a revenue for a service which is now redundant, in my view. So that's where we are with so it's worth saying that many funding agencies now mandate open access publishing. So my funding agencies basically say if you write a paper based on this research grant, it has to be open access, because it's taxpayers who funded your research grant. They should be able to read it. Not everyone in the world wants to read a cosmology paper, of course, but it's a principle which I think is important. So basically the open access movement got hijacked by the academic publishing industry in a way so that it would preserve its profits. And some of us are very angry about this, but there's no point in being angry about things unless you can come up with a way around it, a way of avoiding it. So a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, more or less as an experiment, I started a journal which is now, the terminology for it is now called a Diamond Open Access Journal. There's lots of different kinds of open access, gold open access, green open access, and so on. So this journal is a peer-reviewed journal. It's free to publish in, and it's free to read. It's not, of course, entirely free. Nothing's free. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's no such thing as a free journal. But the annual running costs of the journal that I run, the Open Journal of Astrophysics, are less. They're a few $1,000s per year, and less than an APC for one paper in a traditional journal. And last year we published 50 papers. So that's not a big journal output, but we just started, so it's not surprising. And how do we do it? It's very easy. Journals don't do peer review. We do it. Other academics do the peer review. They just do a bit of organization. So we organize peer review for papers that are submitted to the archive. We have 2 referees. If the referees, there's usually a bit of ping pong between the referees and the authors. If it passes peer review, we publish what's called an overlay, which is basically a pointer to the archive entry for that paper, with all the metadata, the authors and things like that, and a DOI, digital object identifier, which is a unique identifier for a paper that's used in citations and so on. I remember having an argument with a publisher from Oxford University Press who said, well, we justify the £2,000 article processing fee because, we register all the metadata for the article with Crossref, which is a system which keeps track of citations, contains billions of articles around the world. So Crossref is an amazing thing, but most people don't know anything about it. It's there behind the scenes. When you check your citations for your paper, it's Crossref that has done that. And they say, well, we have to register all this, and therefore that justifies some of the cost. Well, I register all the metadata for the papers with the Open Journal of Astrophysics, and I can tell you exactly how much it costs to register metadata for a paper. It costs $1 per paper, $1. So what the other $1,999 out of your APC, I don't know. So the costs are negligible. They're not zero, as I said, but we have a small grant from essentially from the agency in Ireland which runs library services, and $2,000. Last year's cost was like $2,500. That's in the noise when it comes to research grants, so we can cover that without too much difficulty, without charging authors or readers. If we ever get to the point where you have to charge authors, if it scales up incredibly quickly, we could levy a small charge, not thousands of dollars, tens of dollars, but I would insist that we give half of it to the archive, because without the archive, we're nothing. So this started as an experiment. It was delayed a bit by the pandemic a few years ago, and we went along kind of modestly. Last year we picked up because the big astronomy publication in the UK has the rather archaic name of Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, which, believe it or not, is a modern journal, and it doesn't come out monthly either. The Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society switched to this APC system for open access, £2,500 per paper, at which point a lot of people in the UK said no, and we started to get a greatly increased submission rate. So we went up, last year we published 50. Our doubling time is about a year at the moment. So this year we'll probably have 100, next year 200. And the trouble with exponentials is they get silly very quickly. So, I don't know where it'll go. If you want to know whether this kind of thing can work, I will tell you that we've had papers published by a Nobel laureate, George Smoot, a cosmologist. Many fellows of the Royal Society have published with us. And most importantly to me, we have many papers which are published in it led by early career researchers who are actually taking much more of a risk than established professors in publishing in an unfamiliar journal. There's lots of reasons that I could talk about why you should not pay attention to journal impact factors, but I know that lots of bureaucrats do. Our journal impact factor, I don't like journal impact factors, and I'm not saying that because ours is bad. Our journal impact factor is 8.2, which is higher than the other astronomy journals that we're competing with. And so I think we produce quality papers. It's a no-frills service, of course, because the authors typeset their own papers to put them on the archives. We don't do copy editing, we don't do typesetting or anything like that. But when I mention this to authors, they say, oh, great, you don't do copy editing. That means that some bozo doesn't go messing around with the text that I've very carefully written. Copy editing from journals is not always a positive thing. And in my experience, not often a positive thing. So they typeset their own papers and publishing there. And actually we reject a higher proportion of papers than the mainstream journals do. That's not deliberate, that's just the way it turns out with our refereeing standards. I think we're a high standard.
Peter, would you add something about the conflict of interest when the learned societies get into it?
Yeah, I was going to say that. So I mentioned with monthly notices. Monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society is the Royal Astronomical Society's main source of cash flow. The charges from publishing and that. And I think there's an issue there with the learned societies, and Gert talked about learned societies. The Institute of Physics in the UK also has a publishing division which makes very large profits and now is taking those profits via APCs from research grants to fund things that are not to do with research, things like outreach programs and course accreditations and things like that. Many of those things are worthy, but they're not research related, and they're not, the money that we're spending on APCs is not being used just to cover the cost of publication, which is what it should be. So there is a way in which, so the learned societies, all their profits are spent in the remit of the learned society rather than just going to shareholders, but it's still not a transparent way of funding that because it's siphoning off research funds. So I've just recently resigned from the Institute of Physics because I disagree so much with their policy of essentially appropriating funds from research grants to spend on other things. So just a couple of other things. I think we've heard about the difficulties of some of the impact of the publishing industry on scientific research and academic research in particular. Just think about the incentive there now is if you're charging per paper and you're a commercial journal, where is the market pressure going? It clearly is in the direction of you publishing more papers. That's less obvious when it's a subscription-based journal, right? So I know of several cases already where academics have resigned from an APC-funded journal on the basis they'd be told directly by the publisher to lower their standards of refereeing, to publish more papers. And this is where it's got. So the new gold open, that's called gold open access, fool's gold it is actually, is a pressure to reduce editorial standards and to publish more and more and more papers. I think we already have too many papers. I said this yesterday. I think the paper itself is a bit of an outmoded idea, but together with p-values and all this kind of stuff, it's a pressure on people to produce lots and lots and lots of fairly useless papers. And it's easy money for the journal publishers because you're paying for everyone. I don't know if you're ever aware of this concept of a vanity publication. You know, I've been contacted by these who's who in wherever, and you pay just to get your name listed. The new style academic journals are very much vanity publications. You pay, you publish, and it doesn't do science any good. In fact, the pressures on researchers are negative. They make science worse. It's part of the way science is broken, in fact, is that publishing has taken over. People regard science as being the production of papers. And I don't think that's what it is. It's actually, papers are a kind of tangential output of the scientific process. The scientific process is much more than just a collection of outputs, as our administrators call it. How many outputs do you have this year? We are asked to fill in on spreadsheets every year. I think my output is not just scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. Right? Anyway, what's interesting about this is that we're lucky in astrophysics because we have the archive, and everyone has been using the archive for 30 years. I have been putting papers on the archive. Other disciplines don't have the equivalent of the archive, and the archive is not used by all scientists, scientific disciplines equally as well. But recently there's an archive, a prototype one in criminology. There are ones in medical and biophysics, bioscience. And the overlay model that I described is not really fixed with the archive. It could be applied to any kind of repository. And those of you who work in universities will know that your university probably has an institutional repository where all its papers are kept, and an overlay could sit on top of institutional repositories. And remember that these things are run at a cost of like $10 per paper rather than $2,500 per paper or $3,000 per paper. All of that research, all of that funds that could be saved could actually be spent on doing science a bit better rather than feeding the profits and siphoning money off to other things. So I encourage everyone here to think about the landscape is definitely changing, and I think some of these changes are inevitable because people can see that it doesn't cost $2,500 to publish a paper. And it's technology which is driving this. The availability of digital publishing is there. You can't make it go away. And I think the traditional publishers are fighting a losing battle trying to keep their revenue by providing a service which is not necessary anymore. It's the modern era. We don't need these traditional journals. So this poses big, if we now go to a much more federated system of publications where people use repositories and institutions organize peer review between them, which is what we do, we could add this enormously expensive parasite and spend a bit more money on research, but more importantly, everything is open. Another point about APCs, which I forgot to mention, is suppose you're from a not wealthy country with not much research income to spend, you're excluded from publishing in a journal which is charging thousands of dollars to publish your paper. You just cannot afford to publish there. So on the pretext of being open access, it's actually closing the possibility of publication off to many people. And also, of course, you might not be with a university. You have a much wider possibility of people to publish in your journal if you don't have to pay an APC or belong to a university. So this is just a heads up that I think over the next few years it's going to be very exciting. That I think the old model of academic publishing is going to disintegrate. How long it takes to disintegrate is I can't predict. Prediction's always difficult, especially about the future. I think that was Niels Bohr, that one. But it's happening, and I think this change to author pays model has opened a lot of people's eyes to where all this money has been going for all this time, and they're going to find different ways of doing it. And I'll mention another thing that one of the big offenders in terms of profiteering is the journal Elsevier, which runs a very large, it's one of the biggest profit-making commercial journal publishers. Elsevier also has fingers in other pies as well. Elsevier has a front company called Scopus, which some of you may have heard of. Scopus runs a list of proper journals, as it were, and many funding agencies insist that it's not a proper paper unless it's in a journal on the Scopus list. So Elsevier is gatekeeping this thing as well. I recently got the Open Journal listed on Scopus. I had to hold my nose to fill in the application because I dislike Scopus at all, but it actually does matter to people in some countries that their journals that they publish in are listed on Scopus. So we're actually on there. Finally, one last thing that I'll mention is peer review. We do peer review. We do the best job we can with peer review, but some of our reviewers do a fantastic job. Actually, one thing I've learned being an editor of this journal is that if you want really good quality peer review, you ask early career researchers to do it, because they write much more cogent and detailed responses than old professors who actually, a lot of the papers that we do are very technical, and so it's very often the postdocs who are working at the coalface in the field know much more about the details than the people who are in kind of management roles, so they do a good job. And I'm very gratified that young generation is actually on board with this, because they haven't grown up with the old system, and therefore are not kind of used to it, and they recognize the absurdity of it straight away. So that's an optimistic sign. I'll just say, though, that for peer review, we've had this comment before. I think it's worth saying again. Peer review is a way we have of trying to assure some kind of quality in academic publishing, but it's not perfect. And we should never think that a peer-reviewed paper is the gospel. Reviewers make mistakes just as authors do and just as everyone else does. So another aspect of open science which is important is that you have as many people as possible can scrutinize the result. The referees may have missed a bug in the paper. Somebody else reading the paper will find that bug, and you can then go and do a retraction. With our model, it's actually quite easy to change, to publish an amended version, because we just change a pointer to another archive version. So peer review is much better if the entire community of your science discipline does the review than it is if there's just a couple of people who the editor invites. So that's just to say that open access publishing is part of a very important way of mending some of the breaks in science, because science is not at its best when it does things in private. It's much better when it's all done out in the open, where the data's made publicly available, where the scrutiny of scientific results is facilitated rather than hindered by the scientists themselves. I think that's an important principle, and I think many of the difficulties that we've heard about in the course of this event are exacerbated by the current methods of publishing scientific data. So I'll finish there. It's for a bit longer than I thought, but
quick story, which was years ago. I did a story on Alexandra Albakian, who started Sci-Hub, and she was, if you guys aren't familiar with her, she was somebody who was I think she was studying neurology or something, and she was in Kazakhstan and didn't have any money and couldn't access any of the medical journals because she couldn't afford to pay for them as a student. So she was very computer savvy and basically figured out a way of sharing passwords with other people so that she could get their journal articles and then she could share theirs. And this created a repository of basically, I think it's now all medical journal articles throughout history. And there's something also called LibGen that has done this with books. But she's like an international fugitive. She's in hiding. She has been. I mean, the story was like 10 years ago. She still hasn't really resurfaced because the publishing industry, was claiming that she was stealing all their work. But her point was science has to be open, right? We have to be able to see these things, and you're prohibiting me in a poor country from being able to do the work, and I'm curious about it. And I had been interested in it. I think it was actually like a triple dip by how much the sort of workforce is paying for, the taxpayer is paying for all the workforce and the publications and the subscriptions and the libraries. If it's a public institution, you're also paying for the tuition of the kids going there and the professors' salaries. But I'll just add, as a former journalist, when you would see something that was peer-reviewed, you were told essentially by your editor, you can just report that's true. So the idea that peer reviewers are fact checkers is a huge fallacy. Most people don't realize that the the peer reviewers are told to assume there is no fraud or scientific misconduct, and the data is all right. So they're not doing what a fact checker would do in, old school journalism, where they'd really rip it apart, they'd look for other sources. And then this goes through this sort of chain of information, and the media gets hold of it, and they assume it has been fact checked. And they assume that it is legit and verified information. So it creates this real web of bad conduct. And then just one funny thing is, after that story, and my dad is somebody who knows a lot of people in science and engineering, and is friends with Benjamin Lewin, I think his name, he started Cell. And my dad went to him and he said, how did you handle peer review? Em's doing these stories and it's kind of crazy that, there aren't any checks and balances. And he apparently responded to my dad and he was like, I was peer review. There weren't peer reviewers. It was my journal. And if I thought it passed the test, the stink test of me, then it was published. And Elsevier went to him and said, we want to buy Cell. This is an incredible high-impact journal. And he basically gave out a number that was 10 times what he thought the magazine or the journal was worth. And they said on the spot, yes, we'll take it. So he is very, very wealthy now because of that. But he looks at the whole thing and concludes all the same, if it's one person and they're the editor or the publisher and they say, yes, I'll accept this, or no, I won't, and this is my area of expertise, you at least have some barometer of truth, right? Where the standard is being held by this one person. And I think that's part of this. Greg and I talk a lot about how, in the military or in technology, there's no peer review. It doesn't mean that things don't pass. They might be top secret, right? But they still get done because the efficacy and the validation is in the predictability of the outcomes. And I think we do need to get back to something that looks more like that. And I think the business model is, when I was diving into all of that, I could not believe how much money there was being, spent on these things, and that there was like zero labor, right? It's like a dream business model. So I think, Tom, you wanted to say something too.
Dale, what were you thinking on the sole reviewer?
Up and down, yeah. I was thinking, sure, there's two ways to look at this, Yep.
But I would think the market would take care of that over time, right?
Well, the market was taking care of it, except when the business defamation started. CrossFit's dangerous, it's killing people, man.
Perhaps I should add that Peter should be careful not to be assassinated in view of the size of this industry. Maybe you should borrow a bodyguard from one or two people here, but perhaps in the size of this industry, you said it exceeds by 50% the recorded music industry. Are you able to break down the size of academic publishing? Because I think textbooks are still a valuable service. Is that included in that figure or excluded?
It's all academic, so that's difficult with textbooks because not all textbooks are published by the same people who publish journals. And actually the global revenues of the academic publishing industry are dominated by 4 publishers. There's actually Elsevier, Springer, thanks, John Wiley, and Taylor and Francis. And actually John Wiley and Sons recently acquired Hindawi, which is a publisher that had 10,000 retractions last year. It's a very dodgy but very profitable publisher.
I think Tom
Let me just say a few words on this whole discussion. Peter, you're spot on about this whole thing. We in the biomedical industry are behind in catching up with the archives. But you're right. I submitted a paper for the first time to the archives, and you get feedback. But the thing about the archives, from peer review,
is when I submit a paper to peer review, we have 2 or 3 guys that are making the decision about what they think is here, right? One guy doesn't like it, and he could stay in this, go around and around for months sometimes. Got to do another experiment here, another experiment there. But when you do archives, now everybody in the world is looking at that. You have to be super, super careful for not being a, Drago, whatever the hell it is. Because you make a mistake, they come after, you've got a section there where you can comment on this, right? So, because I tore up some guy who didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground on the archives. And you have that opportunity now, and the guy looking at that, whoa, this guy's saying that. So now you're opening the discussions to the world, not just kept behind the peer review curtain of the journal that you're submitting. So yeah, peer review. And the other thing nice about peer review, they're doing a correction about the bioarchives, is they're also allowing you to see how many people are actually looking at your paper. And then you're right, because I get, when I put some of these in the archive, we get all of these these journals that say, oh, well, please send it to us and we'll peer review it and all this kind of stuff. But, just leaving it in the archive is fine. Let it age, and you can add more stuff to it. Like you say, so this is like, and doesn't cost anything. And we're paying so much money, thousands for Frontiers and whatever else journal we're putting in, for them to typeset this. And if the data are correct, then everybody in the world can see. We put everything in there, right? So I think but we're behind the physics guys. We're just starting to catch up because a lot of my friends, well, it's not peer reviewed, it's not going to help me get promoted, it's like that, blah, blah, blah. But when you're old, you don't give a shit. The bottom line is you want people to see your work. That's the bottom line. And people make comment on it, because if you screwed up, man, you get blindsided, you feel like a fool. So you have to be on top of that. And I think that's the best way for science to move forward, no question about it. So you're right, it's going to change, and the young people know this. So they're going to be doing this, and I think this is the future. You're absolutely right, because we're getting dumped upon by all these people taking our money. We should be spending more money on research equipment and research expenses, and we're having to spend all this money on thousands and thousands of dollars to get it into peer review. And then, one of the things I do in my cancer class is we take Cell, Science, and Nature, and we go through the so-called peer-reviewed papers, and we point out all the errors. And then the kids ask me, how would they allow that to be through? Because the peer review system is broken. There's so many data. Now, if you ever see the size of the amount of data put into a Cell paper, I mean, you have to spend a month going through all the, and some of these things aren't correct. You don't have time to look at all this. But you put it in open access, and people will so that's why you be very, very careful with the archives. But anyway, he's right. This is the future. No question about it.
Can I respond? Just a quick... Somebody wanted to comment.
Oh, that Jay over there. JB.
I think a bunch of people here decided to open up a publishing.
First, I'm a big fan of the open access model, and I think during the pandemic it was a real important way to get out word that you couldn't get out through very, very biased peer-reviewed journals. But I should say that I and many other people who were trying to get our message out through medRxiv and SSRN and bioRxiv faced a problem I never thought I'd see from the open access journals. They rejected papers that went counter to the public health narrative. They rejected one of my papers that actually ended up being published in a peer-reviewed journal, because with the excuse that this is too sensitive a topic to publish in an open access preprint journal during a pandemic. So the politicization of these open access journals is not something to, like the immunity to politicization is not something to take for granted, because during the pandemic they failed that test. The other thing about peer review I think is really important is that there is no incentive to do good peer review. There's none, other than trying to impress the editor And that I think is the central problem that we have, right? I agree completely. What happens afterwards in the open access journals where you have that comment section is beautiful, right? And the community you describe of peer review, that's beautiful, right? That's what science is supposed to be. But there's almost no incentive whatsoever, unless you want to get at somebody to like do that comment or do the careful work. So the central problem then is, how do you create incentives to do the peer review? How do you get the young people, like the young people that are donating their time to the journals, that they're taken advantage of basically. Like they should be doing their own science, and because the peer review work they get gets literally no attention. So I think the right thing is it has to come from universities. It has to come from the journals can help by publishing the peer review, giving it a DOI itself. So the peer review itself, and making peer review part of how we evaluate scientists, right? If you do good peer review, it's the analogy I like to think of is like the movie industry, right? Anybody can publish a movie. It just make a movie and put it on wherever, right? And put it on YouTube and you publish the movie. After the fact, there's like this thick review infrastructure. Right, there's like it's 10 stars out of 10, and it was fun to watch people, and then there's like the Roger Eberts who go into some deep dive about some psychological thing I don't care about, and so they just it's like a big deal to be a great movie reviewer. We should have that in science. Like it should be a big deal. We already kind of do, except it's only very few people who publicly do reviews. But that should be the central part of science, like that kind of thick discussion after the fact. So the paper doesn't matter. It's what happens afterwards, right? It's how do people evaluate your idea that happens afterwards that really matters. And then we all should grow a thick skin so that, I had one of the top altmetric scores of all time from a paper I put in medRxiv in 2020. And boy, you should see the comments. They're just like excoriating. It was fantastic. So it was really fun.
I'll just add to that, the idea, and I got this from Dr. Glassman, and he was adamant about this, and I know Greg talked about this, but his view was that publication meant to make it public. And so when you're talking about these problems, I was thinking this when I was listening to you, Peter, is why are we hung up on this notion of peer review? Like, let it out, and if you fall on your face, there's the peer review. There's some great peer review going on in the YouTube comments. There's also a ton of garbage, but you can find some real gems in there. And I think the idea should be that publication isn't the province of an elite, and neither should peer review be. There's things I can look at, peer review. I can peer review. I don't need to be an expert in that subject. I just can see bullshit when I see it. And I can point to the fallacies and you don't need to be an expert in, I don't need to be an expert in anything to know you're committing fraud if I can point to the fraud.
The exposure of the scientific misconduct and fraudulent science is coming out of a private, independent, pajama media kind of people. So if they're pointing out the bad science, like the guy that wrote the software to hunt fake Western blots, it's good work. You think you can work on the other end too, not just look for the bad, but give something a thumbs up.
It just seems to me the idea of peer review is like this overlay that, to Emily's point, gives it this patina of legitimacy and makes it harder to critique and actually peer review. Because somebody else says, it's already been through peer review, and therefore it's been blessed, and the Pope has said it's wonderful, and now no one, you excommunicado for suggesting otherwise. And I think it would be better if we just said, hey, clean it up as best you can, publish it, and it's okay. Einstein had papers that later he was like, there's that famous thing that, people, even within his own discipline, people were like, the guy probably missed it on that one. But nobody held it against them, we all make mistakes. I just think it would be so much better if we thought of publication as, Dr. Glassman just beat me with this, that publication is the act of making public. That's the whole point. And let's crowdsource it. The internet produces wonders when you crowdsource.
Gary Tabbs was recently telling me that when he's gotten really into using AI to translate old German medical journals that he couldn't have read, that earlier he didn't have access to. And one of the things that he's been really struck by is that these old, sort of scientific societies that were looking at problems that he's interested in, when they would publish their results, their argument, their hypothesis, all of that, and they would publish basically all of the criticism they were expecting to get because of prior work or because of conflicting results from another study. And they would rebut it, or they would say why they still hadn't solved for that problem yet. But he said it would be like 40 pages. And with the internet, there's no reason why you couldn't do that too. And so you'd think if you were truly intellectually honest, you would do that as a scientist. You would say, this is what we found, this is what we can't say conclusively, this is the other work that needs to be done, this is the prior work. There's plenty of space to do that online. But I think when you're publishing and you're paying $1,000 per page and it's out of your budget, it disincentives. I mean, and Tom, you've talked about this with me before too, about trying to be able to see the data sets and the cancer stuff that you used to be able to get access to way more information about how the study was done or whatnot, and now it's just sort of this glossy overview of how great the results were. I think that all needs to go.
Can I respond to the responses?
No.
Do I need a mic? Probably I do. So there's one thing that I forgot to mention, and also I want to respond to some of the things that have been raised, which I think mostly people seem to agree with what I've been saying, which is rather nice. One thing is this business about peer review. Now, I said peer review doesn't make something absolutely true, absolutely false. The role of peer review in the journal that I run is mainly not gatekeeping, but to identify obvious errors or make corrections or improvements, mainly the latter to the manuscript, so that it actually improves the quality of the published article. So this is the reason why we go around a number of times before publishing. Usually there is errors and ambiguities in it. It's not just yes or no, this is not good enough for our journal. It's good, but you could make it even better by doing this. So it's editorial advice, really, rather than gatekeeping. You mentioned incentives. It's actually, maybe I'm very naive, but in the community that I deal with, the incentive behind most reviewers writing good, comprehensive referee reports is that they just want the thing to be right. They care about what's being written about, and they will say, oh, this is a good idea, but it could be even better if you included this, this, and this. They're actually very dedicated people, and they want the literature to be a good reflection of the science that's being done. And generally the attitude is to try and help other researchers get their work published, rather than actually say, no, you're an idiot, and I'm going to shoot you down. Well, yeah, I know it's different. Well, look, I mean, arXiv, we've had arXiv for 30 years. Others are just coming to this. The open science movement has been true in astronomy for a long time.
I think the problem is not that, because the communities, there are people dedicated to getting it right in lots of communities, but the problem is that if you have a tremendous amount of money at stake from the output of these things, or court cases or whatnot, there's a lot of nonsense that goes on in the community. You can't assume what you just said about the scholar community talking about it.
I think that the salient factor probably is that we're in a blue skies research thing where nobody really gets rich by making products based on cosmological observations. So it's kind of more altruistic behaviour you get in that community because the stakes are intellectual rather than financial. I think
I picked the wrong field.
Can I say another thing? The point that you made about you put something on the arXiv and people can attack it straight away. I actually yesterday made a comment about how I don't really like the idea of scientific papers that much, and they should be replaced by this kind of a paper with a commentary, and the paper should be updated according to new data and revised according to comments that come in. So it should be a living process that's on display rather than a fixed point. But I do think that the idea that it might make people a bit more careful about what they write because it's going to be immediately made available for people to criticise, is not a bad
You're not going to look good if it's not right.
yeah, so you take a lot more care, and maybe you get fewer junk papers being pushed out on other places. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And the final comment I wanted to make was something that I forgot in my bit earlier on, which is about copyright. The journal that I run, authors keep the copyright to all of their paper. We do not assign copyright to anybody. They can use their stuff again wherever they want to. And that's not the case in many journals. And just wanted to mention that the very first paper that I wrote was in 1986. I was just a PhD student then, and I had a solo author paper. I think my supervisor didn't want to be associated with it, so he let me publish it on my own. And subsequently, I was writing a textbook many years later, and I wanted to use a figure that that I'd made for the first paper that I published. And I had to write to the publisher of the journal, which was then Blackwell's, which is based in Edinburgh, which is the publisher of the monthly notices at that time. And I said, can I use this in this book? And they wanted to charge me £150 because I'd signed over the copyright of the paper to the publisher. And I'd made the bloody thing, and I didn't see why I should buy it back. So I thought, I'm not paying £150 to buy back my own graph. So what I did was I found the program that produced the graph, and I changed the labels on the axes slightly and made another version and used that. And nobody ever complained about it. But that's also a crazy thing, the fact that you produce scientific research and to get it published, essentially you give it to somebody else for perpetuity. That's just wrong as well. So that's my final comment.
150 is cheap. Yeah, I've been charged more. But I really admire what you did, because it sets an example together with other examples. And I think the long-term program must be to take publishing out of the commercial, of the hands of commercial publishers, and all of them, and have an alternative that is non-profit, and that saves us lots of money and gets us out of this kind of slavery, to do work for Elsevier without pay, as a reviewer without pay, you even pay for your own probably. And I think we have to think about something, how we do that, and get publishing back where it was, in the hands of scientific communities. And that should be our goal.
Yeah, so I say that actually a lot of people talk a lot about open access publishing. One thing I did is make a decision to actually stop talking about it and actually try and make a journal that ran on those principles. Yeah. And I think the main purpose of the Open Journal of Astrophysics is to demonstrate that it's not just possible, but it's possible to make a good journal by comparison with other journals. It stands the same kind of level.
It's not about open access publishing, it's about non-profit open access publishing.
Exactly, yeah.
If I could just put the black hat on slightly, which is my favourite colour hat normally. Agreeing with Jay, yes, in cosmology there are not so many issues. I just feel that if you're going to go into the medical research world, then you have to tread very carefully, much more carefully, because there are people out there who will try to obliterate you, and they will try very hard, and they will gain hold of many researchers. If you're going to put something open access, who will review your papers and absolutely slam them to the floor, and they will be being paid to do this. And you're going to face a really more difficult position. So I think you need to. I think peer review should be, after I've had a few cups of coffee, I'll have a peer review just across the parking lot, and which is about as useful as peer review is, in my opinion, unless it's done in the way you say. So I just think that, from regard to trying to get into my world of medical research criticism, I think you need to make it look much more kind of bigger and proper. And if you don't achieve that, it will probably just be attacked to such an extent that it may be destroyed. I just think that we have to not be naive about the difficulties in a field with so much money involved.
Yeah, so I've got no intention of going into that field myself. I don't know. But what I would say is that I think the problems to be solved are simpler in cosmology, as I think we probably agree, and blue sky science generally. If we can't make it work in those fields, it's certainly not going to work anywhere else. So the logic of my approach is let's make a working model as a kind of prototype for how this could in principle apply to other fields. If we can't make it work in astrophysics, then it's not going to work somewhere else because we have such a head start on other fields.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I agree entirely. I don't want to say it's criticism that any can't make it happen. I just think that it needs a lot more degree of carefulness and imprimatur of these peer reviewers are important people kind of thing. So that we can't just have the whole thing attacked and macerated with a champion that I mean, I speak in some way sentiment papers that'll die in peer review in major journals and just not the reason why anything I've heard hasn't been published. So this is not the sort of things that the sort of things we publish and goodbye, that's their argument. So, it's a different problem.
How robust is your website to attack?
Well, it's hosted on a commercial platform, so we actually, it's a third party that runs, and they have the usual cyber defenses. They're not infallible, but they're stronger than they would be if I'd set my own web page up. But it's there are denial of service attacks on I don't know, as part of the open science movement, there's this open source software movement, which is another part of it. People should share their codes. They usually run off a platform called GitHub. People share their source codes on GitHub. There was a massive denial of service attack on GitHub last week, 2 weeks ago, which I think has been resolved. I don't know who was behind it, but one can certainly imagine hostile players, competitors, if you like, encouraging people to do that sort of thing. We haven't had any serious issues yet with that, and I think we're fairly well defended. But we're also actually not really a large publisher yet. If we were really competing with Elsevier, I think we might have a bit more to contend with along those lines. I don't know.
By the way, there is a website by French mathematicians where you can sign up and declare that you will never review a paper for Elsevier anymore, that you will never submit a paper to Elsevier anymore, and you will never be on an editorial team. You can choose between all of these or some of these. Yeah. And I have a question to you. So how about what should funding agencies do? So I'm in another job, Vice President of the European Research Council, the ERC, which is the largest funding agency in Europe. And we have done a few things. For instance, we have instructed the authors of proposals to delete all impact factors from their CV. So many researchers, they cite their paper and then they put the impact factor. What a work, you have to update it. Yeah. So no impact factors, send a signal. And also only to submit their 6 or so best papers. To give a signal, it's not about quantity, but quality. Also, there's an obligation that all those who get a grant publish in open access. But we have so far no means or not found a way to if we could, require non-profit open access like your journal, then we could change the entire system, but that probably would at the moment be going too much. So do you have any advice what funding agencies can do to help you and to help science?
Funding agencies, well, what I would like to see, I mean, what they could, these kind of initiatives like the journal that I'm running are actually very grassroots things. So, and we're doing one in the field of astrophysics. So I think funding agencies should look at this model and realize that they could easily propagate this model into different fields and provide publishing platforms between research institutions that allow publishers to publish, researchers to publish on those platforms at zero cost and just bear the cost from the research grant. It's a tiny fraction of a typical research grant to cover a whole discipline. In the immediate short term for the Open Journal, we're kind of bracing for ever increasing numbers of papers coming in. I give a talk about this subject to astrophysicists departments. I've done a lot of them in the last year. And usually what I say is I don't ask for money or anything like that to help it because our running costs are quite low. But I just encourage people to volunteer to be editors for us, because it's an unpaid job and we need more editors if we have more papers, and to not just dismiss requests to be a peer reviewer from us, because we all get lots of peer review things, and a lot of them from junk journals. So I'm trying to raise the profile of the journal so it's actually a name of a journal that people realize is not a predatory journal or anything like that. So I think a modest investment in infrastructure to make these kind of platforms more widespread, diamond open access journals. To go back to the question of research assessment and proposal assessment, I'm very pleased to say that I was instrumental in getting the Science Foundation Ireland, which is our main research funding agency, to sign up to a thing called the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which is a set of proposals to encourage fair assessment of research proposals. So no impact factors in promotions or grant applications and things like that. That's one of the principles. No reference to the Scopus list of allowed publications. Actually, one of the things I'll say is that in astrophysics, papers get cited a lot. There's a lot of activity in it. So we have a huge amount of information at the article level of the impact of individual papers. So I know papers that published, every paper we published last year with the Open Journal, I know precisely how many citations each paper has. So that's an even better argument for the uselessness of the journal impact factor, because that's a kind of weird average over all the papers published divided by the number you first thought of and whatever. So if you can track citation impact at an article level, there's no need at all to refer to the impact factor of the journal. So we have a paper that's got 800 citations, for example, on that. And that's not, I just think it means, that's a good paper. It doesn't make it a good journal on its own. I'd rather you think this journal contains lots of good papers than this is a high impact factor journal. I'd rather talk about the first thing rather than the second. But I think this general set of principles of how you assess research fairly, not using arbitrary and misleading metrics, is an important thing. So if we can get more countries to sign up to the Declaration on Research Assessment, that would be a very big step forward as well.
So the ERC has signed up?
Yeah. I think the curiosity in Ireland actually is that the Science Foundation Ireland, which is a research body, has signed up, but the Higher Education and Research Department of the government has not signed up. So they're running off different set of rule books essentially there. So we haven't quite persuaded the government to sign up to it yet. But in the UK, all the research councils in the UK have signed up as well, and I'm not sure about other countries in Europe, but the message is getting through that impact factors are junk, you shouldn't be using them, and lots of other stuff is junk as well, and you shouldn't be using those either. I think those kind of declarations are useful only if they, if you just go around saying this is junk, don't do it, then that's only half the battle, because you have to say, well, we do have to choose, we have to fund grants, we have to decide which is the best application and so on. So we have to assess things in some way. So you have to come up with a better set of proposals of how to do it, and DORA does that.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Hey, Peter, Valentina Zarkova's twin dynamo paper from a few years back, the twin dynamo of the sun, the Valentina Zarkova theory, do you know of it? No. The model? No? Okay. I'll send it to you. Yeah, I wonder, yeah, it's interesting. Well, I'll send it to you, I'm not gonna.
I'm not a solar physicist.
Yeah.
So I would have missed that.
Okay, how about aliens? Yes or no?
I think you need to ask that famous expert at Harvard University.
Who is that?
What's his name? My mind's gone blank. There's all these. He claims to have discovered evidence for aliens at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And, what's his name? Harvey Lowe. That's it. It's in the UK press. Whenever there's a headline that says Harvard astronomer does something, that's him. It's always him.
Weren't there some Mexican aliens or something recently?
I don't know, but I stopped reading at Harvard anything. My favorite recently was parenting experts at Harvard. They just like slam on the brakes, hard stop. Yeah. There are no parenting experts, and were there, they wouldn't be at Harvard. Thank you, everybody.